But we can all talk amongst ourselves. Okay, well, in the interests of time and the day, I will go ahead and begin. Welcome everyone to the Wichita State Disaster Resilience Analytics Center seminar series. We are so pleased today to have Dr. George Danner here with us, speaking about translating science into decisions, influenza pandemics in the late 20th and early 21st century. Professor Danner is here in the history department at Wichita State University and is a world environmental historian who examines the intersections of humans and disease in the modern era. Notable book publications include Influenza, A Century of Science and Public Health, and Global Flu and You, A History of Influenza, published in 2012. And an article publication of his called Who Knows Best? Who in that case, looking like World Health Organization acronym, National and International Responses to Pandemic Threats and the Lessons of 1976, was awarded the Lane and Saunders Research Award by the American Library Association. In addition, some of you may have seen his wonderful presentation called Influenza Pandemics Since the Russian Flu, and Do They Provide Insights to COVID-19 as part of the Fairmont College of Liberal Arts and Sciences Perspectives on the Pandemic. His current research focuses on Legionnaire's disease. And all in all, we are very honored and very pleased to have you here with us in the seminar series, George. So I will stop sharing and please take it away.
Thanks, Nathan. Thanks for the very kind introduction. I would suggest you wait to say honored until I'm done today, but I certainly appreciate it. And I want to thank the Disaster Resilience Analytics Center, it's quite a mouthful, for inviting me to speak today. And thanks to all you folks for showing up. So I'm going to talk about two examples of the difficulties of translating the ideas of science into public action or public response and public health response. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen, and hopefully you can all see that.
Yes.
Let me get it to my slideshow. There it is. Okay. So translating science into decisions, influenza pandemics in the late 20th and 21st centuries, and off we go. So I'm going to talk about two specific examples. The 1976 swine flu program, which is, I particularly love this image from the National Archives that I discovered when I was doing my research. And also the 2009 H1N1 pandemic. So to begin by talking about 1996, the swine flu program, I don't know how much you know about the swine flu program or response in general. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background. Any discussion of influenza and its impact and pandemics and their impact has to begin with a discussion from or about the Spanish flu. So the Spanish flu is sort of this boogeyman that hangs over any sort of disaster, especially disease disaster discussion. So Spanish flu had enormous impact, although Alfred Crosby memorably in his book referred to it as the forgotten pandemic. And that is certainly true in sort of public commemorations. You don't see any, or until the last decade or so, you didn't see any statues, or it didn't make it in the textbooks or things of that nature. So it was kind of the forgotten pandemic, but in certain circles, it was remembered very well. And one of those circles would be the United States military. The concern about the impact of influenza on the business of the military prompted the military in January of 1941 to create a board for the investigation and control of influenza and other epidemic diseases in the Army. Again, another mouthful. I think is a mouthful for these things. This board was charged with trying to protect military and military bases from the impact of influenza because they well remembered its impact in the First World War. This resulted in investigations and research into developing a protective vaccine. And in 1943, under Tommy Francis, they did just that. They developed a protective vaccine that was very effective. The 1943 creation of the vaccine opened up the idea that you could prevent the impact of pandemics on individuals or groups. And so this becomes part of this armature of how public health responds to pandemics. There was a number of events. I'm happy to address them in the Q&A if you would like to discuss how we got from 1943 to 1957. But 1957 was really the first time that there was an opportunity to interdict a pandemic. A novel strain of influenza was detected. Cases were beginning to ramp up. And in response, the United States and a number of states around the globe attempted to mount a vaccination effort to protect the public from this pandemic. But the effort failed. And it failed because the vaccines, while effective, are somewhat laborious to produce. And so by the time the vaccines were available for distribution and protection, they were outstripped by the speed of the virus. Influenza is a very speedy, transmissible entity, and so it simply outran the ability to produce and distribute vaccines. So it was a failure. But it was a failure that scientists and public health personnel went to school on. They sought to examine why it had failed, and they came to the obvious conclusion, we have to be faster. And the two elements of being faster are that one, production has to be ramped up and the process to do so foreshortened so that you can produce vaccines rapidly. And also the issue of identifying it. Finding new strains before they emerge as pandemics is going to be key for protecting against a pandemic of influenza. So they get another crack at it in 1968. 1968, the Hong Kong flu, as it was known, also prompted a pandemic. And also, like 1957, efforts to protect the public from this pandemic failed for similar reasons. The pandemic simply outran the ability to produce and distribute protective vaccines. So in the aftermath of 1968, again, the scientific community and the public health community were seeking to apply what they had learned from these failures to the next set so that they could offer some sort of protection. And one of the things that developed in this interim period is a series of predictive theories about the influenza virus. One was known as the recycling theory. And the recycling theory drew upon some observations in 1957 and 1968 that the elderly population suffered a number of cases that was lower than would be anticipated. And so the theory was that there are a set number of influenza viruses that cause human illness, and they tend to recycle. At the end of the average person's lifespan, everybody has lost the ability to resist this particular strain, and so it emerges again. So this recycling theory posited that the 1957 pandemic was not as dire in the elderly population because they had been exposed to a pandemic, similar pandemic strain in 1889, the Russian flu. 1968, similar argument that the argument was that there was a pandemic in 1900 that offered protection. So with this recycling theory, the expectation is the next one in the rotation was likely to be an H1N1, which of course was the one that was responsible for Spanish flu. So those recycling theories were out there. There was a lot of discussion. It's one of the things they were considering, again, only as a theory. Now, the second theory that was also popular at this time was the 11-year cycle theory. And anytime you can create a chart to illustrate it, it's always exciting and persuasive. So the 11-year cycle theory posited that roughly every 11 years, a new strain of influenza appeared, prompting a pandemic. And actually, if you look on the left side of the screen, you see those arrows pointing to what were presumed to be pandemic years. The 1889, the 1918, the 1957, and 1968, very clearly pandemic years. The 1900, 1929/1933, and 1946 ones, not so clear, but nonetheless, that's what the argument was. So by 1976, the idea was that there's likely to be a pandemic by 1979, and it's probably going to be related to Spanish flu and H1N1. This is the background for the events that occur at Fort Dix, New Jersey. Excuse me. In January 1976, a new strain of influenza was detected amongst recruits at Fort Dix, New Jersey in basic training. Upon identification of the causative agent, it was determined that this was an H1 swine N1. And also at Fort Dix, there had been clearly person-to-person spread. So we have a novel virus that is transmitting between humans and coincidentally fits the ideas that it's going to be related to Spanish flu. Now, this is confounding a bit, though, because although this new strain was detected, it seemed to sputter out at Fort Dix. They did not find any additional cases at Fort Dix after January. And surveillance investigations of the state of New Jersey, of the United States and the world did not uncover any additional cases either. So there's a bit of a conundrum. We have what was somewhat anticipated, the appearance of a novel influenza strain. In the past, this had signaled a pandemic, yet we don't have additional cases. So this is the muddle that the researchers are dealing with. And all parties agreed that surveillance coverage was far from complete. It was not a great system of surveillance then. It's better now, but it's still not great, to be honest. So with this information and the experience of dealing with previous pandemics, there was a meeting held, hosted by the CDC on March 10th, 1976. The scientists come to meet with the scientists from the CDC, and they're discussing what this evidence means, what they think it means. And so they kind of reach a tentative conclusion that a pandemic is possible. And I'll put possible in quotation marks. So how possible? Well, nobody could really say. There was a study done by Schoenbaum in which they were tackling a new type of survey method they called the Delphic approach. And so in this approach, they five anonymous, highly experienced epidemiologists were asked for their private estimate. What do you think the odds are that this is going to cause a pandemic? Their private estimates range from 2 to 25%, pretty low. And the median was 10%. So a 10% chance, although these numbers are not sturdy at all. So that small group of senior epidemiologists have that opinion. They did a second process with 10 immunologists, infectious disease doctors, and preventive medicine specialists. These 10 experts were a little bit more confident that there was going to be a potential pandemic. Their median was about 40%. So you have roughly the scientific opinion by the experts involved in research on influenza pandemics and influenza research in particular, roughly have an idea that it's less likely than likely that this is going to prompt a pandemic. Well, less likely than likely, the fact that it's somewhat likely at all puts an onus on public health. What exactly are we going to do? And this onus was taken up by David Sensor. David Sensor is the head of the CDC, had been the 10-year director of the CDC. had been long involved in public health, in translating scientific information and evidence into responses. And he himself was a physician. So he's part of the science community. He's very conversant with the discussions in science, the science community, and he's going to be translating it for another audience. So his job as director of the CDC is to sell his boss, the Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare, on a range of responses, and one of which he's going to promote. Censor puts together what's been called an action memo, and it lays out the case for what the events in New Jersey mean, and it lays out the case for what are the range of responses, ranging from no response to a full government takeover of distribution of medicines, and everywhere in between. Four different types of responses. And in this action memo, he lays out some of the groundwork for how to interpret the events to make the decision. And so he lists the possibility of this new virus causing a pandemic. He lists it as, quote, a strong possibility, end quote. He also lists the description of the virus discovered as, quote, antigenically similar, end quote, to Spanish flu. Now, the insertion of the modifier strong to possibility suggests that it's a greater chance of this occurring than, let's say, what the scientists were signing on for. But to be fair, the antigenically similar is pretty much listed right from the lifted right from the language that they were using. So they're recognizing that it's related in some fashion to Spanish flu, but they're not suggesting that it is Spanish flu. Now, this on 13 March 1976, Censor makes the case to this person. Oh, I should tell you, that's David Censor, by the way. And he's making the case to this person. This is Secretary Matthews. Now, Secretary Matthews is a political appointee. He is not a scientist. And he has in his advisory group 2 physicians who work closely with him. So he has access to scientific and medical personnel to discuss this, but he is a political appointee. So Censor makes his case in a meeting to Matthews, and it's very persuasive. The physicians agree with Censor's interpretation. They have the list of possible responses that will be passed up the line, and Matthews is considering what the decision should be. He signs on to this idea that this new virus requires some sort of response by the federal government. So his job as Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare is to sell the need for this to the White House. And so he sends a summary of the meeting, or a summary of the position of HEW on this to the White House. And in his depiction, he refers to the virus as being, quote, dormant, end quote, Spanish flu, that, quote, will, end quote, cause extensive epidemics and pandemics. So he has ratcheted up this idea of what the potential threats are from this novel virus. Now, Matthew's job ultimately is to convince this person, Gerald Ford, as to the need to mount this sort of protective vaccination campaign. And Ford, who had been informed for several weeks about the progress of this issue, he was not being blindsided by this, was informed of this process, and he believed that if there's going to be a national program to vaccinate every man, woman, and child, as that was referred to, that it's going to need the imprint of the president. So he believes he has to make the announcement, and so he has to make that decision. But Ford is being very careful in this instance. He wants to hear from the scientists directly. So he requests a meeting with scientific experts to discuss this idea about mounting the program and issues related to it. His administrators draw up a quick list of 50 prominent scientists, which they then cut down to 30, because there's only 30 seats in the conference room. So he meets with these 30 people, and he asks for a summary from some of the experts on their opinion on the potential danger of this virus and what the response should be. And then when the response is that we should mount a vaccination program, he asked for a show of hands of the 30 assembled scientific experts, whether or not they support this idea. Everybody's hand went up. And so he said, I'm going to go off to the side, and if somebody wants to speak to me privately about any concerns or questions or issues they think may be part of this, please come speak with me. Nobody comes to see Ford. So after this meeting, on that same day, 24 March 1976, Gerald Ford announces to the nation that he is proposing a vaccination campaign to protect against this potential new virus pandemic. He's very careful with how he states it in his talk. He refers to it as having a, quote, very real possibility, end quote, that we could have epidemic spread of this new virus. And he refers to the virus as, quote, very similar, end quote, to the virus that caused Spanish flu. This is not far out of line with where the scientific community was at the outset of this process. Unfortunately for President Ford and following events, his press release did not show the same measure of restraint. At the same time that Ford was speaking to the nation on this issue, the press release distributed to the media and one that was going to be constantly referred to had a different depiction of this particular set of events. The press release said this virus had been, quote, dormant from 1918, the Spanish flu, that there was, quote, a strong possibility, end quote, of epidemic spread. And in fact, it went further and said, these are, quote, the ingredients for extensive epidemics or pandemics, right? So this interpretation in a remarkably short period of time, we're talking the first sort of meeting for the scientific advisors who agreed to this need for it was on March 10th. By March 24th, we have a very different depiction of what this particular virus is going to do. And so the way I like to think about it is I can conceptualize it as sort of an A to Z continuum. So you have on the one end, A, the discovery of this virus, a mere curiosity, means nothing. At the other end, Z, you have the potential for a pandemic worse than Spanish flu. So there's a continuum of depictions of this particular virus. The science supported an interpretation that was more likely to not have a pandemic than likely, right? They wouldn't go any further, and frankly, there's no reason why you should quantify. David Sensor said he was repeatedly pressed, what is the probability? And he said, probability is not the right metric. We can't put a number on it. There's no way to predict based upon this information how likely or unlikely it is. But in order to make the case to his superior, Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare, somebody who's not a scientist, Sensor shifts it to a strong possibility, a modifier that suggests there's a greater potential of it happening. Matthews, convinced of this argument, is making this argument to the White House. And so, again, we're looking at people who are decision makers, and they are looking for assurance. So Matthew couches it as will. Now, the problem with this is twofold. For the scientists, will and the depiction that was released in the press, although dormant virus would be inaccurate, but nobody could actually say that there was not a chance that it could be worse than Spanish flu. Certainly, there were no indications at that time, but it's well within the possibility that it could happen. It's still within this A to Z continuum, maybe closer to Z than where the scientists are, but nonetheless, it's still in the continuum. It's not an outlandish interpretation. This assurance that there's going to be a pandemic and that it's going to be dire means that if the pandemic doesn't come, you have greatly undercut your position as advisors. which is precisely what happened in 1976. The pandemic did not appear from this novel strain. It turned out to be a curiosity. The effort to protect the public was unnecessary, and there are assertions that it caused secondary illnesses, particularly in Guillain-Barré, a reaction to the vaccine itself. So it caused harm as opposed to protecting against harm. And memorably, the New York Times referred to the whole event as a fiasco. So that's the case for 1976. So in 2009, we have a 2009 H1N1 pandemic that appears, and it's a triple reassortment from influenza viruses that have been circulating. And so again, a little background helps us understand how this process unfolded and what it meant. In the early 2000s, the WHO was very concerned about the poor response or poor set of events related to SARS, and also were greatly concerned about a pandemic of influenza that was caused by bird flu, which was circulating at the time. The SARS response was alarming because one state, China, sought to hide this emerging series of infections from the rest of the world, and the rest of the world was not informed until it was already circulating throughout Southeast Asia. So under the international health regulations at the time that were very old, really only protected against cholera and plague. So those were the elements that when they appeared under the international health regulations, you were supposed to report. Well, they modified that by saying any illness that has potential for public health international concern, public health emergency and international concern became the new metric. So they sought to broaden it in response to the fact that China did not report out SARS. Bird flu was also a great concern. And bird flu was circulating through wild and domestic flocks of birds and occasionally was infecting humans. Now, it was not being readily transmitted between humans. There was debate whether or not there was any transmission between humans. But nonetheless, people were contracting bird flu, H5N1. And when they did so, they had very dire outcomes. The mortality rate of confirmed bird flu cases in the early 2000s was about 50%. So extrapolating a version that could spread more readily was alarming, as you can imagine, for public health. So out of this, they came up with a new formulation. They created a series of phases to determine when steps should be taken. And so this phase system is largely about transmission. It's trying to identify emerging infectious diseases from animal populations and then set up an effort to interdict them before they turn into pandemics. So the idea is that something is going to jump from an animal population, a zoonosis that's going to begin to infect humans, but it's not going to be well adapted for humans or for human-human transmission. So if we can disrupt this transmission, then potentially we could disrupt an emerging pandemic. That's the idea behind it. And it's largely about transmission. And it carries with it sort of a sense that severity is assumed. In some of the supporting documents for international health responses, they do talk about severity, but severity is very difficult for making decisions on public health matters because severity is not apparent initially or may not be apparent initially. Sometimes it is. It may take a little time to really assess how severe this particular ailment is. And further, the ailment can become more severe over time. We can use the historical example of Spanish flu. It's the second wave of Spanish flu that is the big killer wave. So the virus mutated into one that was much more dire for the people who were infected with it, and also apparently became more transmissible. We can think of contemporary issues. We've had a number of variants of COVID of greater or lesser virulence with the people who are infected. So this severity concept is sort of baked into the assumptions on this. And to be honest, they're looking to the East Asia, to keep an eye out for bird flu. Well, nature throws a curveball, and instead of being a bird flu, they have another H1N1 that appears not in Asia, but in North America. 18 April 2009, the first cases of this novel strain of influenza are reported to the WHO. This immediately puts us into phase 3. By 25 April 2009, it's discovered or confirmed that there are cases in Mexico that are circulating. This brings us to sustained human-human transmission, phase 4. By 29 April 2009, there is sustained community transmission, not just in Mexico, but in a number of states. So we have widespread human infection. That's phase 5. And by 11 June 2009, the WHO announced we had crossed into phase 6. The pandemic was in progress. So the ideas behind the phases are about generating responses. And baked into this system of responses are when certain phases are declared, it triggers automatic responses. So the triggering of responses in the form of antivirals. So there are antivirals that are useful for protecting individuals against influenza infections. And so when a phase is declared, antiviral stockpiles are released by the WHO and national health programs. When phases of sustained transmission are triggered, it triggers or announced it triggers vaccine responses, purchasing, guaranteed purchasing, and setting up systems of implementation of protective vaccines programs. So these things were set in motion by the declaration by the WHO. And there were critics. And the critics first revolved around the idea of where is the severity? So the pandemic is supposed to be causing a number of cases. There doesn't appear to be a number of cases, and the pandemic doesn't appear to be terribly dangerous to many folks. So there's few cases and fewer deaths. In fact, it appears that it's lower than seasonal flu, yet we have mounted a massive international response. So that was part of the criticism revolving around the severity issue. Another part of the criticism is the questions about who are the experts determining we have moved from one phase to another for the WHO. And the WHO did not want to release that information. They wanted to keep their experts' identity secret so they were not harassed or lobbied by various folks. But the question is, were these folks tied to pharmaceutical houses? Were they incentivized to declare this process, which would trigger the release of antiviral stock holds, which will then have to be replenished at some point? Were they being paid by pharmaceutical houses who manufacture vaccines? Because companies are going to profit from making these vaccines. So these questions were asked, and they were not particularly well answered by the WHO. In fact, the WHO Secretariat, asked by a CNN reporter about this issue of severity, instead of addressing the question, removed the language of severity from their website. Not a good idea. So all these things led to increasing criticism to the point that on January 22nd, 2010, the WHO released a public statement that in effect said, we're not promoting a fake epidemic. We really do have a pandemic going on. So this story of 2009 has a coda. And the coda is, if you look at the metric of how much of an impact there was from the 2009 epidemic, well, if you count up the number of people who die from this particular pandemic, the number is not exceptionally large. In fact, some seasonal years of influenza had higher mortality totals. So by that metric, if you look at it, then 2009 is not really all that big a deal. And so that would suggest the idea that there was an over response. But if you use another metric, then you can see that the 2009 pandemic was very dangerous. And that other metric is years of life lost. And I'm going to give you, if you don't know, I'll give you a simple explanation of what that is. If the average life expectancy is estimated to be 75 years of age, If somebody dies of influenza at age 70, they have lost 5 years of life because they were taken before the average. If somebody dies at age 20, they've lost 55 years of life. And so by that metric, years of life lost, the 2009 pandemic was indeed very serious. When you look at seasonal outbreaks of influenza, and to a slightly lesser degree, pandemic years of 1958, 1967, you see that the numbers or the average age of the people who died during those pandemics is somewhere in the 70s, right? So not average, but the mean. So if you plot the mean out from all the victims, the mean is somewhere in the 70s, because influenza traditionally takes the very young and the very old. If you plot out the mean age for the 2009 pandemic, you get the mean age of 37.4. It's dramatically different in who it targeted and how that is measured in years of life lost. In fact, 37.4 is the second lowest, I suppose, age mean for deaths from influenza pandemics, which is only outstripped by the dreaded Spanish flu, whose mean was 27.2 years of age. Looking at it in this fashion shows that the years of life, by using the years of life lost metric, that the impact of the 2009 pandemic is greater than the 1968 pandemic, which everyone agrees was, or everyone generally agrees was truly a pandemic and was quite awful. So that brings me to the conclusion here. So two problems are illustrated by these two particular examples. So in the case of 1976, overselling to get the program, shifting the word possible to will, and then including dire outcomes helped to sell the program. It helped to convince the people who vote on these things, who are not scientists, Congress, the people who implement or make these decisions who are not scientists, the White House, that this was absolutely necessary. And it ended up in how this was marketed to the public. And the problem for this is if it doesn't occur in the dire way that it's being promoted, it opens up questions about whether or not people are either malfeasant in doing so or somehow being corrupted. The 2009 novel H1N1 pandemic response deals with a slightly different issue. The public assumes that pandemics means severity. And to be fair to the public, the scientists who developed this phase idea kind of had the assumption that severity was part of it. So a novel outbreak of some infectious disease is going to have severe consequences. That's the general assumption they were operating under. So thinking about it in that terms, if the pandemic doesn't appear to be severe, as it didn't, then that opens up questions of why are we going through these expensive operations if it's not a severe outbreak? Compounding that was the decisions of lack of transparency on the case of WHO. This helped to foster conspiracy theories. I know it's crazy to think about, but some people find conspiracy theories when there are epidemic diseases. Okay, so these are the two examples I have. I think they illustrate two problems and challenges in translating science into public health response or information for the public. And so I would be delighted to address any questions you have. Here are my credits page for the images I used. Any questions you have?
Thank you so much. I want to iterate that I put in the chat. You can chat questions if you'd like, and I'll try to represent those to Professor Daner, or raise hand and speak out.
I might start. Having looked at people's attitudes towards natural disasters like tornadoes and floods and fires and so on, and becoming complacent and skeptical, and then lives being lost during those events. With what's been happening as you describe, and then through this most recent pandemic, I wonder how well we'll survive if we actually do get a very serious pandemic, much more severe than COVID has been.
Yeah, that's a good question there, Glenn, because one of the issues that the epidemiologists talk about today is as bad as COVID has been and the impact that it's had, they're hoping that this will serve as a dress rehearsal. Because when you look at something like COVID-19, who has a mortality rate below 1%, then there's plenty of things out there that may be very transmissible that have significantly higher. You think about how disruptive Spanish flu was in the early 20th century, its mortality rate is estimated at 2.5%, which means overwhelmingly, most people survived, much like today, but it was enormously disruptive, as COVID is today very disruptive. Some epidemiologists, talking about that, are hoping that this will serve as a wake-up call for greater investment and greater preparation for potential future health events. Now, in similar fashion, a few bad rain years is not the same thing as a 500-year flood, but responding to things that may be misidentified as occurring once every 500 years is something that requires investment and planning ahead of time.
Yeah, there's two parts to the problem. One is the actual response when something does happen, which costs money and causes consternation if it doesn't turn out to be so severe. And then the cost of building resilience into communities, which costs a lot of money, like changing building codes, stopping people building on floodplains or in places that are at risk of fire. That all costs a lot of money. And then there's a lot of resistance from the community because they don't want to spend the money. But then when the disaster happens, they expect the government or some fund to bail them out.
Right. So if you think about, whatever processes that could have been put in to be more proactive about the appearance of COVID-19, they would have been expensive, but the expenditures are dwarfed by the impact of the pandemic running amok. I think of the case of New Orleans. So the levee system, shoring up the levee system, expanding it to withstand Category 5 hurricanes would have been enormously expensive, but it's a drop in the bucket to the expenditures we've had because we didn't. And so that difficulty of projecting into the future the potential, and it can only be a potential. Nobody could predict that a Category 3 hurricane was going to do such damage to New Orleans, precisely, or that it was going to happen this year. But they certainly could predict that potential is out there.
Yeah. Thanks.
Gio?
Muted. Hi, George. Thank you for the presentation. I have a question regarding basically Dr. Fauci, because I had no idea that this was an issue before. So you mentioned that they kept the scientists kind of a secret, so they would not be in the press. I would assume they would not be related to the pharmaceutical companies. But I think that is one of the main issues that we have had in this pandemic, right? Not only one or two people that have been bashed by everyone in this country and in other places with the organization, international organizations, but also because everyone assumes that there is money, right? That there is a pharmaceutical company that that has created the virus, or it's somehow profiting from all this. And to be honest, that remains always open. Like, is this, I mean, was that the best solution, or why? And these are all pharmaceutical companies, and there's always this lobby. So how is that has impacted? Because I mean, you've seen all these pandemics and how all these people in these key positions and these scientists have been, or I don't know, impacted by this. And also, what is the standard in other countries? I mean, compared to what we do here because of lobbying these companies, because I think that in other places, the idea of the scientist as the scholar, has a better position in society. It's not constantly being questioned, right? So how is that the perspective of the North American view or international point of view is different than what we see here? And if that has changed, because I see, I mean, somehow I see, I would say Fauci, but I'm thinking scientists supporting specific vaccines and companies. So I'm assuming that this process ethical process has changed in the late years or something like that. So 2 questions, I'm sorry. Thank you.
Yeah, so a good question. So I think that pharmaceutical companies don't really have a great reputation anywhere on the globe. So there's always going to be some suspicion that things are going to fatten their wallets, right, at the expense of human health. I think that's a natural multinational view of pharmaceutical companies. But I think about, so the 2009 example, keeping these experts, or trying to keep these experts, of course it always leaks out, but trying to keep the experts anonymous to protect them was really kind of an unusual approach, right? So it was kind of tried at that time. The WHO always relies upon expert committees, and the expert committees, you know who's on the expert committees because they will release who's on it, but their deliberations are usually kept, private. But what they recommend is public. So you know who's on the committee and what they're doing in terms of what they promote, not necessarily what their discussions are. And the impact of that lack of transparency and undermining faith, I can think of one example, and then I'll make an example in recent times that's also relevant. France was a country that was strong supporters of vaccination. But this idea that the 2009 conspiracy to sell vaccines really resonated in the French public. And so since that 2009 pandemic, the acceptance and support for vaccination has steadily decreased in France. And so the French public today are very skeptical about vaccines and have been at various times in dealing with COVID. So that depiction of the merit of vaccination programs changed because of questions and suspicions about what happened in 2009, at least in France. And I think in recent times, Brazil is a state that had strongly supported vaccination for a very long time. And then in recent time, under the current president, the actions of the state to support vaccination have been very markedly different. So part of the challenge in terms of this is that public opinion, it's sometimes hard to gauge where they're going to go. And then you have the role of political officials in shaping these responses, right? So quite a related series of challenges, but a little bit different, right? So when one aspect of the political world is seeking to take advantage of demonizing scientists or working against the efforts of vaccination programs, then it can have a tremendous impact. And in the case of France, a lasting impact. Ethan, I think I saw your hand up. Did you have a question?
Yeah, just following up from those remarks. Thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate your time and your thoughts. But I was just thinking more about just the political environment of the pandemic in the U.S. I mean, the politics are so polarized that, you know, the decisions, the discussions in public are so polarized. Has that always been the case in the U.S.? I mean, you spent some time talking about the 1976 situation, but I would just like for you to reflect some on what's happened recently in U.S. history that has created this environment where, you know, the discussions are just so polarized and so political.
So there's been, most of my particular research work is focused around influenza. And so I can speak a little bit more confidently about responses to influenza, but I can speak a little bit about other programs. There's always been groups who are resistant to it. The anti-vaccination movement goes back before the 20th century in the United States and further back in Britain, well into the early 19th century. So this resistance to public health vaccination has a long history, and you see it. I can give you some examples. You know, the number of hoaxums that were spoken about Russian flu, the secret cabals that are responsible, or, you know, the efforts to produce a whole range of toadstool medicine protection against this Russian flu pandemic. There's enormous amount of literature about, or enormous number of examples about that. You have anti-mask leagues in 1918. They're opposed to the masks in the Western United States, and they form groups and lobby against it. So in 1957, a group of doctors in San Francisco said the vaccine is more likely to cause a bad impact than the virus is, right? Which turns out not to be true. 1957 killed over 1 million people in that pandemic. So this tradition of people being opposed to it or seeing some sort of conspiracy or promoting some sort of, whatever is going to make them money to protect against it, that's not a new phenomenon. But what I would say in this particular realm right now, dealing with COVID, what is unusual is we haven't seen political candidates who seize on this as a way to generate political support. There have always been people who have been resistant or have seen conspiracies, but we haven't seen one aspect of the political world who has seized on this as a way to generate political support. And the way you show your loyalty to your political support on the spectrum is to proudly resist getting any sort of recommended response to this pandemic. This I would say is, in my mind, brand new. I can't think of any organized political effort to generate support for electoral support based upon rejecting this aspect of public health in this fashion.
Thank you so much, George. Do you have time? There's a couple more questions, but
Sure. Yeah.
Okay, there's a couple of things I would like to share quickly about ongoing things and for the students who might be, and then we'll move to the next question, but you must say, it's your time. So I'm just going to quickly share for any students that might be here and participating in the using this for credits for the 360, that you should be able to scan that, or I will put the link to that into the chat so that you can directly get credit for attending the seminar. And then just super quickly, I wanted to add, and I will put all these links in the chat as well. If you want to know more about what we're doing at the DRAC Center, there's the website and other presentations. And this is also where we will post Dr. Daner's presentation if you want to revisit it. And he has kindly agreed to take further questions. If those are bubbling in your minds, you can contact him directly. And then some upcoming events that we have in March are with university libraries, or really from university libraries, but in accordance with DRAC concerns. We have a Dr. Joseph Kursky and a Mr. Mark Stewart coming from ESRI, really the leader in global GIS technology, that will be presenting an open lecture on Thursday, March 24th at that time. And that link I'll put in the chat. And then a workshop that has much more limited attendance on Friday. So I just wanted to make those clear, and I will put all that stuff in the chat while we take more questions. Kyo, you can go ahead.
Okay, hi, I had another question. So my question is, they were saying, because you know that I have a kid, so they were saying that in some areas of Europe, maybe France, as you had mentioned, I had no idea. This is information we don't get any at all. So I had no idea that, for example, a previous vaccination issue had happened, for example, in France. But they were saying that England, France, and other countries in Europe, where the rates of mumps or other vaccinations were decreasing. So that is somehow creating these diseases to come back.
Yeah.
So what's the history about those things? I mean, is there any moment when people decide, oh, I don't want to get the polio vaccination because it's bad, and then we get like polio back, which this kind of thing. I mean, how is that this? I don't know. It seems counter logic, but it is what is happening. So what is your opinion? What do you know about that, George? Thank you.
So one of the big problems, and it's a problem in public health in general, and it's also a problem in talking about, building in resiliency ahead of events, is that when public health works, you don't see it working, right? So that's the thing. The public health success in getting rid of diseases of certain types makes it, people forget about what it is. And so it's an issue that because these diseases which used to be everyday diseases, they were called childhood diseases because all children got them, right? And so because we've been successful in eradicating children from getting them, that people have forgotten what the impact was. And so because they've been successful in protecting so many people against measles, people have no idea how bad measles is. And because there's a, part of the herd effect of giving large percentages of the population protective vaccines, people who aren't vaccinated are protected because everybody else has gotten the vaccine. And so the experience of, my oldest child didn't get the measles shot, and they haven't gotten measles. So my second child's not going to get it, and my third child's not going to get it, or my neighbors aren't going to get it. So that protection by herd immunity is undercut because people don't see the effect of measles in the community until it appears. If people asked their grandparents about measles or polio, they would have very vivid memories, and they would very much be absolutely, we're going to get, yes, as Maria says, there's a whooping cough outbreak in Boulder, right? These are things that are part of the problem, is that the success of public health, people don't recognize the importance of public health until these things happen. Vaccines or vaccination is really largely a 20th century phenomenon. So we don't have this sort of historical ability to go back and see what were they thinking in the 17th century, right? Do we see reoccurring patterns? It's a much more recent, and for the bulk of these protective vaccines that we give our children, it's late or mid to late 20th century. So we don't have the experience of people not getting protective vaccines, right? So that's kind of a new phenomenon.
Thank you, George. Thank you all so much. I do feel we could go for hours and hours, but very much appreciate the instigation and representation of the complexity of public-private policy scientist interactions. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
So if anyone wants to follow up, you can contact George or Drac, really, and appreciate all of your coming here and look forward to seeing you going forward.
Thanks for coming and thanks for having me.
Thanks, George.
Our
Gave us
pleasure.
lots to think about.
Have a great Friday and weekend, everyone. Thanks, George. I'm hanging on just to thank you some more.
Yep. Yeah, I'm happy to do it. I was happy to do it. So
It's really perfect.
anytime.
One of the things we're really struggling with in the center is coordinating translation. I was going to say transmissibility, but between local, federal,
Yeah.
how do we make changes if we know problems? But I really loved that, man, that phase thing you had, and the part about, I don't even know what to call it. How do you think about it? The upcycling of strong to whatever it needs to be to have action take place. You know what I'm saying?
Well, how I think about it is that, they were convinced that this was a very real possibility. And they have a sense that the complexity that the scientists have about, they can't categorically state this is going to occur, that they were afraid that would make the message soft, and that it would give the Congress or the White House the opportunity to not do it, right? Because, well, who can say, right? And so they tried to make it stronger, I think, because they wanted to make sure the program was accepted by the people who were going to make those decisions, who they know are not scientists. So someone like Censor bumps it up because he's selling a political appointee. And, there's background stuff on that too. Censor didn't think very highly of Matthews. When I interviewed him, he made a reference to, he wasn't somebody that made decisions quickly. And so this is a real time sensitive decision. And so he didn't think that he was someone who would make a decision quickly. So he tried to present it as strongly as he could, or as most persuasively as he could. He gave an example. So when I interviewed him, he said, there was a simple issue about how much sound earmuffs should block out for construction workers, right? Relatively simple. And he said, it sat on his desk for 8 months. So I'm thinking that Censor's like, if this sits on his desk for 8 months, there's no, why are we even talking about it, right? The decision has to be made very quickly in order to even be able to mount a program. And so he ratcheted it up in order to persuade somebody who he didn't think was a good decision maker. And then the decision maker, the political appointee, ratcheted it up because he knows that the White House has a lot of issues going on. And so he wants to make this a priority to underscore, he's persuaded that it has to be done quickly, right? And so this desire to move things quickly, I think, plays a role in how they present it to the next audience.
Yeah, but it's so interesting between the ethics of the different domains, right? Because I think in your early part of the pandemic prediction numbers for the swine flu, I think it was, right? It was between 10 and 40,
right?
Scientifically. And then you had to ratchet that up, but that sort of is unethical for the scientists to, right?
Right.
And I feel like we saw during the COVID thing, just partly because there's so many information modes, you could really see the disjuncts between
Yeah.
the public, various communities, the government, CDC, who, like everybody was disjuncted. Translation was bad, right?
Yeah, I would agree.
We did not have communicative communication across the domains that the domains involved trusted.
Right. And I would say that I would agree with that, but I also think there was a political element, right? Which is unusual, So one of the charges, and it's interesting that two people I interviewed about events in 1976, a French and a British researcher, both brought up independently that they thought the decision in the United States was tied to the fact that the president was running for re-election in 76. So they saw a political aspect in that, right? Which most of the works done on the swine flu program don't reach that conclusion, right? So the people who read the internal memorandums and how those things are developed don't have that conclusion. They understand the charge, right? And maybe there are some political operatives who say this will be good for Ford, right? But that's not what makes the decision. But it's interesting that some people, particularly outside the United States, see it as being a faction of that. Whereas in the case of COVID, there was political interference. We have members of the administration who are trying to rewrite the CDC's reports. That they're putting pressure on them to not depict it in this fashion, right? So the charges that were lobbied or lobbed against the Ford administration, which I don't think have merit, have very much merit in the case of COVID. And so then you have distortions from political persuasion that are fragmenting the message in addition to the problems of translating it's brand new. There was no experience with this particular virus, what it means, what's going to happen, what's the best responses. Those are things that were unfortunately learned on the way, but then it's complicated by political interference.
But I know there was a lot of call out, so I kind of tried to look around that 1908 smallpox New England Supreme Court case, right?
Yeah.
And that feels similar, right? That had a lot of politics going on in it.
The Jacobson case, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Anyway, yeah, it's nuts to me. I see Mariah's hanging on.
I think she's probably just left it on.
Anyway, I don't want to take up too much of your time.
She's getting credit for signing in, so she forgot to sign out.
But I really appreciate, this is ideally what we, are struggling with in the team of how to communicate ethically across and communicably or understandably, right? Across these crazy different weights and measures.
Yeah.
So much appreciated. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I was glad to do it. Thanks for inviting me.
You bet. Have a great day.
All right, you too. See ya.
Bye.